All right. All right. So, like I was saying, today's class is going to be about container gardening. And we're going to learn about how to grow in containers indoor and outdoors. Cool. So, this is a really great skill to know, especially living in DC and in cities where there's very limited actual, soil to grow in the ground. So, today we're going to talk about like types of plants that work really well and ones that don't work well in container gardens. Going to talk a bit about growing tips, types of containers. There's a lot of good and bad ones. You need to know which ones are safe and which ones are not safe to leave out in the sun. Drainage and soil. Talk about maintenance, and then we're going to talk a little bit about self-watering container. Normally I do a demo on how to create it, but I don't have the supplies being stuck in my house. So we'll just talk about how to actually make self-watering containers. But cool. So go ahead, get started. So plant varieties. So I know there's a lot of words out, on this slide, but yeah, just you couldn't stop adding things to different, different suggestions on plants. But basically, I mean, when we think about container gardens, we're going to talk more about containers. But ideally, I mean, like biggest container most people will probably have are these like 5-gallon paint buckets. I mean, that's a really great size container. That's a decent sized soil, but a lot of other things are going to be smaller pots. So you got to think, you got like really top heavy plants. That pot's going to fall over, every time, you got like plants that like grow, and like huge vines and stuff. That's going to be really difficult. So what you're mainly looking for with plant varieties when you're doing container gardens is you want the smaller types of plants, like greens, root vegetables, herbs, like strawberries, things like that. Small things work really great in containers. Things that aren't going to like get top heavy, aren't going to knock over your pots, things like that. That's typically what a lot of people grow. But then and then some people they do want to kind of expand and they want to go beyond that. They want to grow the tomatoes and sweet potatoes and things like that. Eggplants and stuff. So if you're doing that, if you're going beyond small plants, you want to pay attention to the varieties, and you want to look for there's multiple different varieties that you want to look for. You want to look for things that are dwarf or patio or bush varieties. So those three descriptive varieties are basically they're compacted, versions of these plants. Like beans. Beans can grow as vines or they can grow as bushes. And if they're a bush variety, they're going to be a nice, small, compacted bush that's going to, do really well in the container and may not fall over. Eggplants. There are like dwarf variety eggplants, and then there's like cucumbers. There's patio cucumbers. These are all small things that are meant to be grown in containers, but you don't want to be fooled. There's by baby versions, baby varieties. So when typically you see something like a baby eggplant or baby watermelon, that's still a huge plant. It's just the actual fruits are smaller. So whenever you see baby, that means it's small eggplants or the small watermelons. It does not mean it's a small plant. So don't be confused by baby. Look for your dwarf, patio, or bush varieties. And then if you want to do tomatoes, I really recommend understanding getting determinate tomatoes. So we talked a lot about this in the when we talk about pruning tomatoes. There's two different types of tomatoes out there. There's determinate and indeterminate. Indeterminate means that it's like your sun golds and stuff. It's what most people grow in tomatoes. Type of tomatoes that just keep on growing all summer long. We'll get like 6-7 feet if you have the proper structures. Will just produce all summer long. Those are typically what people do, like sun golds and beefsteaks and stuff, because you can eat a lot of tomatoes all year long. And determinate tomatoes are a little bit different. They're more compacted bush tomatoes. They usually get like 3 or 4 feet. They typically don't need trellises. They're nice sturdy bushes. And they all ripen at once within like a couple weeks, rather than producing ripe fruit all summer long. And that's why a lot of people they call these like canning tomatoes or sauce tomatoes, or they're like the Roma tomatoes, the husk cherries, ruggers, because you're just overwhelmed with tomatoes. So a lot of people can't eat them all fresh. I mean, a lot of them are good fresh, but they're better. They're preserved and made into sauces and canning and things like that. But those are really fantastic tomatoes if you're wanting to do tomatoes in containers. We'll talk in a second about how to actually do indeterminate, but determinate work really well in containers. And then, like I said, we talked about bush varieties. So a lot of things are either bush or vine or pool. Sometimes they call it pool or vine. So pool and vine, like beans and peas and tomato, and cucumbers. A lot of these, if they're pool or vines, that means they have like, they grow in vines along the ground. I mean, it's preferable to give them trellises, to trellis them up, but they just continue to grow all season long, kind of like the indeterminate tomatoes. But bush varieties are more compacted. They stop growing after a little while. They can do better and like they actually can be a lot more resistance with like lower sunlight levels and heat things, and they're a little bit more resistant. But they're really but the bush varieties are really great for container gardens. You want to look for bush varieties with your beans and peas and cucumbers and things like that. Particularly if you're doing squash. Typically, there are variations, but typically summer squash, and the difference between summer squash and winter squash is summer squash are more bush-like and they produce all year long, like the indeterminate, tomatoes are all season long, they're warm weather. And winter squash, summer squash are like your zucchinis and crooknecks and things like that, yellow squash. Winter squash is more of your hard, skin squashes, like your gourds and pumpkins. And those typically, produce all at once, like the indeterminate, like Roma tomatoes, determinate tomatoes. So that's why when you go to pumpkin patches, all the pumpkins are kind of ready to be harvested at once instead of like, slowly picking up pumpkins throughout the season. So that being said, summer squash, tend to do a lot better in these containers because they're nice bush varieties. I mean, they can get big. You're going to need a big container for summer squash, at least a 5-gallon bucket, but they are a lot nicer varieties as opposed to like winter squash. Will just keep on growing, in vines out of your containers, and we'll take you need to figure out a way to trellis. You can do vine varieties, but you have to build pretty strong trellis systems, and that's a little bit difficult with containers. I'll show you a slide on different ideas of trellises. A lot of times you want to just push them up against a fence or wall and build and like install your trellis on the wall, because if you're just like having some bamboo coming out of the container, again, that's going to be top heavy. The wind's going to blow. It's going to knock it all over. So that's why you really want to focus on bush varieties, small patio, dwarf varieties, small vegetables, determinate, you want to get that small compacted things. But there are some varieties, if you do really want those determined tomatoes, or you really want like sweet potatoes or vining plants, I do see a lot of people will do hanging containers, and these are really cool. I had a buddy that lived in this apartment complex. He was on the 3rd floor and he didn't have any room to grow. It was a very small studio apartment, so he planted a bunch of tomatoes. He got some of these 5-gallon buckets. He actually poked the holes in the bottom of them, stuck a couple tomato seedlings from the bottom, let them kind of grow upside down, and he would just hang them out of his window. I mean, it got kind of crazy. I mean, once like it eventually got 6, 7, 8. It was like blocking the window below him. It was getting that bit crazy. But he would just pull out the tomato, pull it all, just like like a rope, just pull it all into his apartment, harvest what he needed, and then throw it all back out. So that's like more of an extreme version. But a lot of people do have a lot of success. Like if they want to just start hanging containers, like hanging these tomatoes work really well. Typically, people will puncture holes in the bottom and let them just grow out. But you can plant the tomato on top and just let it fold over. I think it gets a lot more circulation and sunlight when it's just hanging from the bottom. But sweet potatoes, you want to plant those definitely on the top and just let them like kind of hang over. So this is a sweet potato plant. They're really beautiful, and you can actually cut off a lot of and saute and eat these sweet potato leaves. They're really delicious. You can saute them like kind of like a collard, like spinachy kind of things, and they're real delicious. So these are 2 different ways. If you want to do vines and you don't want to build a crazy trellis system, you could start hanging some of your pots and let them just kind of flow over, and that works really well. The last thing I'll talk about with varieties is you want self-pollinating things that have both male and female parts in their flower, so they can actually pollinate themselves. The reason being, and these are for indoor varieties. I should actually make a note. This is mainly for indoor. if you're growing indoor. If you're growing outdoor, do whatever you want. But if you're growing indoor, yeah, you want to make sure you get proper pollination. So, and that, most things can self-pollinate, like your tomatoes and cucumbers and all these things everything we talked about up here can self-pollinate on their own. But things that need a little more help are like berry plants. We'll talk more about berries, and we have a whole fruit tree class coming up, and we'll talk a lot about berries. But like raspberries, blackberries, and all that stuff, those you'll need to bring those outside to have some pollinators come and pollinate those berries. So when the blooms start opening up in spring, that's a good indicator to bring the pots outside and let them get pollinated. And then you can bring them back inside once the blossoms go away, and they'll start forming fruit indoors. Or if you have some things like your squash and a lot of cucurbits, you can actually hand pollinate. We have a whole slide on I believe the second class where we talk about hand pollination. But they have two different flowers. One's a male, one's a female. You can tell the female because it has an ovary on the bottom, and once you see all the female flowers open up, you just rip off a male flower, pull off the petals, and just kind of hand pollinate all the female flowers, and you'll have like perfect pollination with that. So yeah, definitely if you're doing indoors, think about pollination. But overall, again, you want smaller the better. You want more bush, more small varieties, things that have been bred to be for patio and balcony usage and things like that. Or you can think about creative ways to grow big things like hanging them upside down. So here's so on top of so now another thing a lot of people do with container gardens is indoor herbs. This is probably the most popular thing that people grow in containers, just because it's so easy. A lot of things, like growing a tomato in a container. I mean, it takes a little bit of skill. I don't want to scare anyone away. Try it out. I mean, everyone's can do it, but herbs are just super easy to grow indoors in pots. Herbs in general are just very easy to grow, especially like the perennial herbs that come back every year. And you don't have to worry about replanting them and watering them and all that stuff. But there's some real great like perennial herbs like lavender and rosemary and thyme. So those you plant them in the pot. They grow up and they don't die in the winter. They just keep on surviving. So eventually, though, they get so big and then the root ball gets so woody that you have to divide them, which is basically kind of just pulling them out of the pot and just taking some saw, scissors, whatever. You can be as brutal as you want and just like cutting them into different pieces and then repotting them in bigger pots or in whatever. And then like you can plant them around your garden, or you can give them away as gifts and things like that. And if you keep on doing that every couple of years, you do that at the end of the winter. March, April is a good time to do that. That will keep your perennial herbs very happy and healthy. But then annual herbs, these are the things that are probably not going to survive more than a year. Most of the times they'll die because of winter, and then sometimes they just don't. They're not they won't survive. But some of these things may turn into more perennial if you keep them indoors in warm environments in the winter. And we'll talk more about how to make annuals into perennials. So you have some great cool weather annual herbs like anise. Cilantro is a big one. Cilantro, it's delicious. It grows really well in cool areas, but as soon as it gets just a little bit warm, that cilantro is going to go ahead and seed and die. So that's why indoor cilantro works really well. Dill, things like that. And then warm weather annual herbs are like basil, borage, chamomile, and savory, things like that. Definitely check out like the last class. I can update. I should probably update this on temperature wise, but a lot of these cool weather, herbs, I mean, they can start germinating, between like 50 to 70 degrees, and then warm weather stuff typically needs, 60 to 70 degree, temperatures. So, yeah, make sure if you're going to do warm weather things, that your house is at least, heated to about 60 degrees. But cool weather can probably be a little bit cooler if you're keeping your house cool and saving some energy. And then but pruning is a really important thing to understand, that what's great about herbs is the more that you harvest, the more that you pick, the more fruitful your herb will be. That's same with like peas and beans and things like that. Like the more you harvest, it's like it kind of prunes it, and then like when you're pruning, you actually stimulate growth, and then the more growth happens. But there are some unique, some special ways to harvest some of these plants to really produce a lot. Like for example, basil. If you just plant a seed, individual basil into the ground as a seed, it's just going to be a single stalk that grows up. It's going to have a couple leaves, and then it's going to flower, and then the leaves get bitter, and it dies. So you're not going to get a whole lot of basil leaves. But ideally, what you want to do is you want to turn that single stem into a multi-stem bush. And how you do that, and you can do this with basil, lemon balm, different kinds of mints, mainly herbs like soft herbs that branch out. So ideally, what you want to do is, like, when you look at these herbs, you can see every time it branches out, there's little tiny buds in the armpits of the branches. And a lot of times those are dormant buds, meaning they won't grow because they're being held back because it's using all this energy just to grow the main stalk. But if you find that intersection and you pluck out the top of that, and you can eat that, just do this like every time you want to harvest some basil, just pluck off the tops of each basil plant and eat those. But if you do that, what's going to happen when you pluck that off, those little two buds in the armpits are going to start growing, and all of a sudden you're going to have two branches coming out of that single stalk. And then you do that, again, like, a couple of days later for both of those branches. And then all of a sudden you're going to have 4 branches, and you keep on doing that, and you're going to have 16 branches, and you're going to have, and hopefully you'll have a nice, really thick, compacted bush. If you're harvesting that, if you do that every other day or every day, every time you harvest. So definitely recommend doing that. You could just pinch them off, as long as it's soft, if it's soft herbs, you can just pinch them. Really, when it's the perennial woody herbs that you might need some scissors or pruners to kind of cut those off. But then so that's really for your branching, herbs. But then you have non-branching woody herbs. So like that, there's your perennial, like rosemary gets pretty woody, and you're going to need some pruners to harvest them. And then like dill just doesn't. It's a single stalk. It just doesn't want to branch, out. So there's not much you could do. So basically, with these kind of things, you do some kind of structural pruning in the spring. Like especially with your woody perennials, mainly just cutting it back, because a lot of times they'll get too big for your pots, and you cut it back or divide it or whatever, and then you just you don't worry about actually pruning these throughout the year. Yeah, you mainly just focus on your basil and your mints and stuff, your branching stuff, to make them into bushes. And then the location. So you ideally you're looking for a south-facing window. That's where you're going to get the most sunlight. It may be a little bit tough, even with a south-facing window, during the spring and fall and winter, because the sunlight, we just have a lot less sunlight during that season as opposed to like summer. You get a south-facing window, you can get like 10 hours, of sunlight, but that's drastically, different during the spring and fall, and especially the winter. So you may need to supplement. You may need to get some grow lights. They make a lot of these handy little herb grow light stations. If you don't want to do a whole grow light setup, we'll talk more about grow lights. But also a lot of times, if you could just reflect the sunlight, get some mylar or aluminum foil or something, and just reflect that sunlight, bounce it back and forth. That should accumulate. So if you don't have enough sunlight, you can expand that. But another thing you want to make sure is if you have a drafty window, especially in the spring and fall and in the winter, you want to do something about that. You want to get that plastic wrap, that weather stripping plastic wrap you put up against the window. You use your hairbrush or not hairbrush, but hair dryer, to dry it out and seal it, and that's going to keep it. Because if it's drafty, you may be drastically reducing the temperatures of the herbs, and it may get too cold and may kill or hurt your plants. So you want to make sure you don't have a drafty window, or if you do, just put some plastic up on that. And then fruit trees, like I said, we'll have a whole class on fruit trees, but I just want to talk about fruit trees. Some fruit trees make really fantastic container gardens. Particularly, like, there's certain ones that just grow smaller and work really well, especially the ones that don't do well in this climate, like a lot of your warm weather, things like lemons and limes and citruses. I have both a lemon and lime tree. I keep them in a container. I bring them out, in the summer and keep them in the full sun and on my porch. But then in the winter, I bring it back in and actually keep it in my basement in a cool, dark place, and it'll go dormant. So those are great. Figs work really well. Figs are very flexible. Technically, they're not supposed to. This is not the climate for them. But they do grow really well in this area, especially in the ground. I mean, a lot of times if we have a harsh winter, it'll kill the top part, but the roots usually will survive harsh winters and they'll grow back. But figs love, container gardens. I mean, containers, they do really well. They're very adaptable. Mainly though, you just don't put anything, like you need at least a 5-gallon bucket, at least one of those paint buckets. If you're going to do a fruit tree, you need a decent size. Don't try to put a lemon tree in like a very small container. It's not going to survive. And then then they make lots of dwarf varieties for more for trees that actually do well in this area. But let's say you can't, like peaches and apples and cherries, like you want to grow some of those, but you just don't have the yard space. Some of these, like apples could get like 30 feet tall and need like 30 feet diameter spacing, so it could be a lot of space. But they actually make different varieties or different sizes, like standard, semi-standard, and dwarf. Now how they do that is they actually they'll grow a small rootstock plant, and then they'll cut off the top of that plant, and then they'll take a cutting of an apple tree, like a red delicious apple. They'll take a cutting from a branch, and then they'll attach that cutting to that small rootstock. And then what will happen is those traits will kind of mix together, and then they'll have a red delicious apple that will only maybe be like 5 feet tall. Or a lot of times they do that for disease resistance too, if they want to and give mix up different traits and things like that. But if you're doing a container garden with peaches, apples, or cherries, you want to look for dwarf varieties. So these are varieties that aren't going to get more than 5 to 10 feet tall, and really more likely like 5, 6, 7 feet, unless you have like a huge container and some really nice soil. But you can kind of see like the measurements down here of standards can be anywhere from 15 to 30 feet with a lot of these trees. Like apples and cherries can get pretty big, and cherries, they make some a lot of bush or shrub varieties of cherries that may not necessarily say dwarf, but you want to look for like bush cherries and things like that when you're looking for cherries. But these do really well. But a lot of these trees, peaches, apples, and cherries, you want to keep outside because they need the frost to kind of stimulate proper fruit production for the next season. So you want to have them, be touched by frost. Particularly with apples, really need that frost. But a lot of times, though, if they're in a container, they may not be protected so well. The root ball. So what I'll do is I'll actually bury the whole container into the ground, and then just mulch it on top, and that way that the root ball will be protected if it freezes, but they're still getting that frost. So a question here, can you force a standard tree to become dwarf? You can, but it's just not very healthy. Like if you stick a standard tree into a small container and prune it really heavy, you might get away with it, but it's going to keep on trying to expand that. And a lot of times you're going to have kind of a sick tree. One exception to that are fig trees. Fig trees want to grow, 20 feet tall and 20 feet wide, but they're very versatile. A lot of people will, because a lot of the figs actually grow on new growth. So that means all the fruit is actually on the tips of the branches. So a lot of people will cut the tree back, sometimes to the ground, or at least really back really hard. So a lot of the fruit is reachable and things. So it's a very versatile tree. And I know if you stick that into like at least a 5-gallon container and just and prune it really heavy every year, it does really well. So just wanted to clarify from my notes, pull the container out of the ground for summer enjoyment on your porch, and every winter bury back in the ground. Yeah, so I mean, again, that's if you have the opportunity to actually bury these guys. Yeah, try to, if you can, yeah, during the winter, try to bury the container, cover it in some mulch, and then bring, and then when it warms up a little bit in the spring, you unbury it and bring it back out. Again, like if you're doing a container garden, it may be because you don't have space to bury it. So think about, like you maybe, just maybe give it some protection from the north-facing winds. That's typically in the winter. The harshest part about winters are the winds that come from the north. So maybe keep it on the south, on the south side of your house, and just give it some protection from those north winds if possible. Again, we'll talk a lot more about fruit trees and how to deal with that in the fruit tree class. How often would you pot up a containerized fruit tree? So that's another. Usually not often. If you have a nice size 5 gallon container, people aren't, yeah. I mean, I never. I mean, a lot of times you could buy your plants in the pot size that you want. Like I bought both my lemon and lime tree in 5 gallon containers, and I've never potted them up, and I've had them for years. A lot of times, I mean, you may have to give them some fertilizer and stuff. I mean, they'll be happier if you could put them. All plants are happier if you can pot them up into bigger plant, sizes. But with container gardens, you're doing a container garden usually because you don't have the room or space. So a lot of these things, as long as they're in a 5 gallon container, they'll be fine. You don't need to pot them up. You may need to give a little bit of fertilizer every year, or top dress some compost, but they'll be fine in 5 gallon containers. All right, and then another really cool thing about annuals and perennials. Are that yeah, when you're doing container gardens, a lot of these things, a lot of annual plants are only annual because they can't survive a frost, but they would keep on growing if there was no frost. For example, pepper plants. I know a lot of people that had like 3 4 5 year old pepper plants because they'll put them grow them in a container, and they'll bring them inside over the winter, and they'll keep them going. They'll and then they'll bring them back out. As soon as it in mid-May when it warms up again, they'll just keep on growing them, and that's really great because you have this full fruiting pepper plant that's starting mid-May, so you're going to have a huge growing season if you do this. The problem is every year it does get a little bit more sicker, and it'll eventually die after a while. But you can get multiple years from some of these plants if you can bring them inside. And when you bring them inside, you have two options. You can either keep growing them, which or you'll need some lights or some south-facing windows or something. You'll need to water them and keep tending them and stuff. And you can grow them all winter long. Or what a lot of people do is they give them a rest. They give them a break, so they'll let them go dormant. So how that works is I'll usually I'll let them kind of dry out outside a little bit, and once the soil is dry, I'll bring them indoors. I'll just keep them in my basement in like a cool, dark, dry area with no sunlight, and they'll kind of go dormant on their own. And I won't water them. I won't do anything to them until the next spring, and then I'll pull them out. I'll bring them outside. You have to harden them back off. Whenever you bring stuff indoors, and when you bring them back out, you have to re-harden them. Which we'll have a slide on hardening, but it's just like slowly over a week, introducing them outside and getting them used to that outside. And then they'll lose a lot of leaves, so they'll kind of readjust a little bit, but then they'll start growing again once it's warm enough, and you start watering them and stuff like that. So. And I do that a lot, like lemongrasses and stuff. Lemongrass is a tropical or humid, tropical plant, so it can't survive our frost. So we'll bring our lemongrass in, let it go dormant in our basement, and then kind of bring it back out. All right, so now some growing tips on so growing indoors. So this could be a little bit tricky growing indoors. So a couple things. We're going to talk a lot about light in a lot of different slides, but the trickiest part is like finding that south-facing window, and then if that's not enough light, or if you don't have a south-facing window, figuring out ways to supplement that light from reflecting it to grow lights. It's nice having circulation. Like in a greenhouse setting, we have fans constantly circulating, and just so we don't have a lot of fungal issues and things like that. Plants want that, but you can't necessarily do that, in your house at all times. But I mean, sometimes houses have ventilation already, with heating and HVAC systems and stuff. So just making sure that it's working properly and the filters are properly working is always good. But if you can add some kind of like oscillating circuit fan, just to, you don't want to aim the fan right on your plants because that's going to dry things. But you just want maybe just have an oscillating fan that just brings a little bit of circulation in your room, and that's going to help out and help your plants out. But that's like I wrote that when possible. Not everyone's going to you're not going to buy a bunch of fans and ventilate your whole house just because you have some house plants. But when it's possible, do give it some kind of circulation. Watering is a big deal. So ideally, if you have a sink, I would recommend grabbing your whole plants and bringing them into the sink, and then just like kind of like drenching them with water and letting them dry out in the sink, and then bringing them back to where they're at. And that way you're not going to have any water spillage or things like that. But if that's not possible and you have to bring a watering can and watering your plants, make sure all plants have saucers and ways to actually capture excess water, because you will water more than it needs. I mean, and then that pot needs, and it will be, so finding excess, capturing that excess water from trays and things like that, and just being very aware of, like, where your electricity outlets are and keeping that, away from them. Um, and also, like, is letting your plants actually dry out a little bit. I think the number one cause of indoor home plants and house plants dying are overwatering. So I mean, you want to have this nice balance where you want the water, the soil to somewhat dry out, but not to stay dry. You want it to kind of like, the idea is like to do a water check where you stick your finger in the soil a couple inches, and if it's moist, if it's really moist, an inch down there, don't water it. You don't want to water plants that are already the soil's already wet. You want that to kind of dry out, and then, before it's completely dry, watering it again. So it takes a little while to kind of get the habit of when to water it. But the general sense is, like, yeah, I mean, sometimes you can't help it. Like, I'm about to go on vacation, I'm going to water my plants whether they need it or not. In greenhouses and stuff, and with humid environments, dry out, I'm going to water them any day anyways, because I know it's going to dry out. But for the most part, a lot of these houseplants, once they establish, let the soil kind of dry out, a little bit before you rewater them. That will allow oxygen to get in the soil. The roots actually need oxygen, and it will, prevent any kind of fungal issues and things like that. But again, a lot of this is just like, do what you can, and yeah, these are ideal, situations. You want to try to keep your temperatures, between 65 and 80. Most things will grow in there. If you're just doing cool weather stuff, you can probably drop down to 50s, or so. But for most part, most things need to be between 65 and 80 degrees. If that's a problem, you can also, instead of heating your whole house to that, you could just find areas that are warm, like on top of an old refrigerator, radiators, or things like that, and just heat the little area instead of heating your whole house. And also, again, like, if you need to do plastic in windows and things like that, if you have drafty windows and have plants next to them. And the last part is pests. So we're going to talk a little bit more about fungus gnats. We have a whole slide on that, but it's a very common, like, kind of like, they're like fruit flies that they deposit their eggs into the soil, and they have larvae, and then they hatch, and they have fruit flies everywhere. And a big way to, like, if you have issues with that, just get some pea gravel, mulch, and mulch on the bottom, different kinds of gravel mulch, because they don't like to, they won't lay their eggs on gravel. They like, exposed soil. So that's one way. I mean, you don't have to start out with that gravel, but if you do eventually have that stuff, you may want to get that. We'll talk more about fungus gnats in a second, but mainly you just want to inspect your plants. Whenever you buy plants and bring them indoors, you want to inspect them. Look on the bottom of the leaves. You'll tease out the top layers of the soil, making sure there's no insects and stuff in there. Because when you bring in stuff in your house, that could be, there's no predators, there's no natural ecosystems. I mean, they can just go crazy. So you want to, be careful, inspect your plants before bringing them inside, just to make sure you don't bring any kind of insects and stuff. All right, so one question: should you let water sit in the saucer, or should you empty the saucer each time after you water the plant? That's a good question. I don't know what the, I usually let it sit there because I know it's going to, soil can actually, it's like, forget the technical term, like, but it will actually suck up water, excess water. So that water will be eventually sucked up as the soil dries out. It will actually and suck up that water back into the soil. But at the same time, I mean, it's a hazard. Someone knocks into it, you're going to spill water. It may, it may make things more humid in your house, and raise, moisture levels and stuff. So it's really up to you and your own personal preference. Capillary action. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, that's the word. Capillary actions are when, like, oxygen areas will actually, pull water into them. Cool. Yeah. And then light requirements. Again, some of the stuff is redundant, but we definitely want to. That's just because that's one of the most important parts. Is you have to make sure you have decent sunlight. So if you have a south-facing window, like most plants, full sun. Especially your warm weather stuff like your tomatoes and peppers and things like that. They need 6 to 8 hours, which isn't like a whole day. A whole summer day could be up to like 14, 15, 16 hours of sunlight. So you really just need to capture, like two cardinal directions, like south and southwest or something. So having a south-facing window, should get you, if not 6 hours, close enough. It depends. Like in the summer, definitely you're good, but in spring and fall, the sun's lower. There's less sunlight, so you may be struggling a little bit. So you might have to supplement. But having a south-facing window should get you, all the sunlight you want with maybe with a little bit of supplementing, like having reflecting the sunlight and stuff. Then partial shade. So let's say you don't have a south-facing window, you have an east window and a west window. East facing or west facing window, so that you're only going to get a couple hours in the morning or a couple hours in the evening of sunlight, so you're probably not going to get your 6 hours. So I don't think if you only have east facing windows or west windows, I would not recommend full sun plants, unless you could supplement it with grow lights. But there's a whole bunch of really great, we call them shade tolerant or partial shade lights, or partial shade plants that do really well. There's a list of plants down here, from your greens to a lot of your herbs. Remember, most herbs probably only need like 4 hours, and they'll do fine. Root vegetables, legumes like peas and beans. The bush varieties are actually a little bit more tolerant to less sunlight. Do even better with some less sunlight. Even like gooseberries and currants and things like that are really well. I got really into gooseberries just because I kept on growing blueberries. And blueberries are a little bit difficult. I mean, they're actually easier in container gardens because they need a little bit more, slightly more acidic soil, and which is really hard when you're planting a blueberry next to other things that like normal soil. So it's a balancing act, but it's actually they do well in containers because you can actually acidify that soil. You can get amendments that will acidify the soil a little bit, and they'll be happy by themselves. But I had a lot of blueberries just start dying, so I started doing gooseberries. They're about the same size, same mannerism. They're super easy to grow, and they're really delicious. I definitely recommend gooseberries. But yeah, again, like if you're not getting that amount of sunlight, you could time it. I mean, it's a good, especially now while everyone's like social distancing. It's a good time when you see that sunlight comes out in that window. Hit a stopwatch, and then check it. I mean, you don't need like the exact minute, but check it once an hour, and you're looking for the exact, how many hours of sunlight you can get, and that should, tell you a little bit of whether you have enough sunlight or you're going to need to, supplement. Another, good sign if you need to supplement is if all these things aren't, plants aren't growing upward, but are like reaching towards the window. And if they're doing that, if they're reaching, and they're getting leggy, that means that they don't have enough sunlight. And you can counteract that by turning the plants at 180 degrees every couple of days, and that will kind of like, build a stronger structure. But if it's reaching, you should think about, either reflecting sunlight, trying to, get more sunlight in there, or, trying to do some kind of indoor supplement sunlight. We talked all about this during the last class on how to grow your own seedlings. So definitely check that out if you really want to get into like supplemental lights. And like I said, they make some really nice package, like herb garden lights fixtures that, where you can, where it's all in one. You don't have to think about it. You just buy, for $50, they'll have lights and it'll grow your plants and stuff. And but if you want to, build your own lighting structures, just some of the things that you're going to need. And this is going to be a kind of a yeah, like I said, a lot of people heard of all this. We talked a lot about this in the last class, so this will be a review for people in the last class. But for grow lights, you want a full spectrum. There's different spectrums based on heat with lightings, from like cool to warm, and plants need different parts of light to grow at different stages. So if you have you just have a cool light, maybe you can germinate it, but it's not going to it's not going to get the light it needs to produce fruit or things like that. So you want to find things like grow lights, aquarium lights, plant lights, let's say full spectrum, or just get a fixture that has one cool and one warm light. If you have both of those, that will provide a full spectrum. And you get fluorescent or LED lights. But LED has come a long way in the last couple of years. It really wasn't an option like maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, but now it's a pretty good option for grow lights. You need some kind of fixture to attach it here on the stand, or if you're growing on shelving, you can attach them on top of the shelves. There's a whole bunch of options, in that last class on different fixtures. Having a timer, so you don't have to like manually turn them on and off. And then having things, different other things like fertilizers and fans and stuff like that. But definitely, check that out. I mean, these are kind of setups for more seedlings, but you can adapt a lot of these setups if you're growing, like, if you want to grow tomatoes and things in your basement, or if you have a west facing window and just not going to get enough light. So a couple questions. Missed what the Mylar blanket was on the last slide for. Yeah, so Mylar for reflection. Mylar, there was actually a slide in the last class that talks about all the different things, and they're, what reflects best. Like tinfoil is great. White non-glossy paint reflects really well, but Mylar is actually like the most reflective surface that you can use for reflecting chlorophyll and sunlight. And if you want to get free Mylar, you go to the end of a marathon. They hand out those like fire blankets, which are Mylar blankets that everyone to see, warm up, after a marathon, and then everyone throws them in these giant piles, and you can just grab as much Mylar as you want at the end of these. And that stuff, using that, you can cut it out and make, make boxes and cardboard backings for your plants, and that will reflect the sunlight. So that's it. Yeah, definitely recommend Mylar. Let's see. It is for reflecting light. Oh yeah. Oh, okay. Is there going to be a slide on types of pots? Yeah, we're going to talk all different kinds of pots in a second. That's the next section. And then a couple other considerations to think about if you're growing on balconies or rooftops. Just know, like, the higher up that you get, the stronger the wind gets. We had a beehive on a 6th floor on the top of rec center that was 6 stories tall. And those bees didn't survive. I mean, those bees would just come out of the hive, and the wind would just they'd just be gone because the wind would be so crazy up there. Or actually, I think it was like a 4-story building, but there's there's rooftop farms. There's a couple of them in DC are starting them, and then there's some in New York, and like the wind is just so harsh up there that you really need to think about, like, if you're more than like a story or 2 up, you need to think about some kind of wind breaks, just to kind of break up that wind, because you want some wind, you want some circulation, but you don't want your plants to just get beaten up by the wind. So think about, a lot of people do, like, when they got more perennial and sturdy plants, they'll plant those around their perimeter, and then have their more delicate plants in the middle to kind of get protected a little bit, utilizing balcony structures. Like this person actually put netting on this balcony to kind of break up the wind a little bit, and trellises. Wicker fences work really well. This is really cool if you have just an individual container. This person stuck in a bunch of bamboo on the north side where the wind is going to come the most, or whatever direction the wind's coming. And that bamboo, even though it's not going to completely protect it, but you don't want to completely protect it. You just want to break it up a little bit so it's the winds. So you're still getting circulation, but it's not getting beaten up. So you want to think about, especially if you're in a balcony or you're high up, think about different ways to kind of break up that wind so your plants aren't just getting punished every year. And then again, mulch, we definitely encourage mulch whenever possible. I mean, mulch is just a great thing for your gardens, and it allows you to water a lot less. It keeps you consistent moisture levels in your soil, which helps with different nutrients being absorbed, like calcium, and it reduces calcium deficiencies, suppresses weeds. I mean, we'll still get some weeds, but a lot less than if you just had exposed soil. And it just slowly feeds organic matter to your soil. So mulch is great. The mulches that you would want to use for your gardens are straw, not to be fused with hay. Straws for for horses, hay, or no, straws for people, hay's for horses, because hay is like a wild field of grass. You cut everything down, it's got seeds and stuff, which is protein, and so they want to feed that to horses. And then straw is like a farm grain. They chop off all the tops, the seeds, and then they're left with just stalks. So you want straw, or shredded, shredded bark mulch. So this is a good shredded bark mulch. Trees like shredded bark mulch. They like more woodier mulches, that's more pro-fungal. Trees typically be more inclined to beneficial fungus, as opposed to like vegetables are more, they like more beneficial bacteria. Living mulches, planting like clover and stuff. You just want to wait till the plant is established, and then and then just seed clover around the edges. And clover is actually a nitrogen fixer. It'll slowly feed nitrogen to the plant, and it'll act like, it's not very competitive, so it's not going to prevent that plant from getting water and things like that, like sod or grass would. And then just gravel mulch again. If you're having fungus gnat issues, definitely get that gravel mulch. That will help you out. You want to avoid things like hay, wood chips. Wood chips are too heavy in carbon. We'll talk more about this in the compost class, but they're good for paths and things like that. If I sheet mulching, I lay some cardboard on all my garden paths and then lay mulch on top, or wood chips. That's really good. But if you just put raw wood chips, they're looking for nitrogen to absorb, to continue to break down and continue to compost. So if you put a bunch of raw wood chips on top of your garden, they're actually going to suck nitrogen out of the garden, use that to compost themselves, and then they'll eventually leach the nitrogen back, but it's just not very efficient for your gardening. It's not the worst thing in the world. You can still grow garden fine with wood chips on top, but I just recommend more like things that are somewhat broken down, like shredded wood or straw. Works a lot better. And then avoid dyed mulches. A lot of them have toxic stuff that are just going to leach out into your mulches. And never do more than like an inch or two or three, or so of mulch, because you get too much mulch, it's going to actually prevent water from getting to the soil. So what is the purpose of cardboard under the chips for a path? So cool. So cardboard, it's called sheet mulching. Sheet mulching is used for a couple different ways. Like if you want to prepare, like if you're going to do a new garden in your yard and there's a bunch of sod, you can actually sheet mulch it, where you lay cardboard out and then lay a bunch of compost and wood chips and stuff on top, and then water it, and then come back the next season, and that should it kills your grass and breaks up some of the soil, attracts beneficial insects and stuff. So you can use sheet mulching to prepare your gardens, new gardens, but you can also use it to just suppress grass, and especially like a lot of like invasive grasses, like sedges and crab grasses and things like that. So what you do, because if you just lay normal wood chips out, it will suppress a lot of things, but there's still like grass, and then the hardier things are still going to grow through those wood chips. So you lay cardboard down in the paths, that will keep anything from growing, your weeds from growing, but that cardboard is just going to fly away. So then you weigh it down with wood chips, and then that's a great way to not have to worry about weeding your paths all the time. Is there a place in DC to collect free mulch? There is. The Fort Taunton transfer station. So a lot. So DPW, they'll suck up all of our street leaves, and then they'll send them out to Pogo Organics. It's a tree nursery that actually composts a lot of those leaves, and then they bring them back to Fort Taunton's transfer station, and people can go and pick up their. It's like a mixture between compost and mulch. Sometimes it'll be finished compost and you can mix it in your garden. Most of the time, it's about half finished, so it's like a nice mulch that I would recommend laying on top. Just a heads up though, sometimes they do get trash in there. They don't sift it, so you may see some like wrappers and stuff, so it's not, some people don't use it for organic, like they wouldn't put that in their vegetable garden. They'll use it for like trees and things like that. But I know a lot of people that do, and they're fine with it too. So it's just really personal preference. Will the chips be bad for the garden plants if the chips get messy? What do you mean, like I get messy? We'll wait for that answer, but also, so next one, could you use cloves? I'm guessing saying clovers for outside gardening. For sure, like for if you're talking about clover, yeah, you could definitely seed clover as a living mulch. I mean, it takes a little bit of balancing. It's not a beginner garden thing. You got to like time it right, and you need to weed it so everything kind of works well. Because a lot of times, like weeds will overtake clover, so you got to give it some supplement. But then sometimes, like clover, like I get clover in my strawberry patches, and clover will actually. It's not very it's not. It doesn't affect bigger stuff, but like things like strawberries, it can compete. So I have to weed out the clover. So it's a balancing act. So. But once you get it right, it's really cool, and it adds a lot of nitrogen. It feeds your garden all year long, so it's pretty cool. All right, so let me know about the wood chips and the messy thing. I don't understand the question, but feel free ask. I'll clarify that. But I'm gonna move on. And then, so if you're doing tomatoes in pots, you want to go ahead. We talked a lot about this already, but you want to plant tomatoes, 2/3 of the tomatoes into bury that because any part of that tomato is going to become super quickly a part of the root ball. So if you plant, I know it looks sad, like you just like buried 2/3 of that tomato plant, but within a week, that all that buried part is going to become this giant root ball, and then your tomato is just going to blow up afterwards. So definitely recommend doing that for all your tomatoes. Okay, so here's so the chips could spill over in the garden or get in the soil for the next season. Bad for plants. Yeah, it's not really that. I never have to worry about chips really blowing that well. I mean, chips are heavy enough where they typically don't blow all over the place if you have a lot of wind. Um, so yeah, it's never an issue. I would chip all my paths, and I never really. I mean, sometimes maybe a little bit will get in the garden, and it's really easy to pull back. And it's not that big of a deal. You just don't want to you don't want to cover your entire garden in wood chips because it's just like I said, it's going to actually absorb some of that nitrogen. It's not, as opposed to other things that are already break it down, and they don't need to suck up all that nitrogen from your garden. Is there some place to get wood chips free? Yeah, so that's for sure. That's the $1 million question that I've been working on for like a decade. So you can email me. I have a list of all the private wood chip companies. It's good. You can call them and ask them for some free wood chips. Sometimes they'll help you out, especially if they're in your neighborhood. And a lot of times they have to drive these wood chips like way out to like Vienna or Merrifield to actually sell the wood chips. So it's just not worth their time. So if there's a local place in the neighborhood, they'll drop them off. A lot of times if you see someone doing grinding up a tree in your neighborhood, it's all right to approach them and just be like, hey, can I have those wood chips? A lot of times they're super excited and appreciative, and they'll give you the wood chips. But the thing about using private companies is you have to be very careful. If you get a load, you got to like call them up and be like, thank you so much, super grateful. That's all I need. Because sometimes when they get a nice spot, they'll keep on dropping off wood chips. And like I've had times where we only needed one pile, and then the next week's 10 piles are dropped off, and it took all summer to get rid of those wood chips. So it could be an issue. There's a couple websites now that are really good for getting wood chips. I can't remember the name. I have a whole slide on this in the composting. So if anyone's looking for wood chips, send me an email. I'll share you that slide. There's this new website that coordinates wood chip companies, and I've heard it's actually been kind of successful. And on top of that, we have an urban forestry association, the people that take care of all of our street trees. All the city arborists work for them. They're housed in the Department of DC Department of Transportation. So they have a website where you can actually request wood chips, and also they have like a mill. They have a portable mill. They've been milling like street trees and making picnic tables and stuff. And so you can actually request those things. It's just I've heard it takes a long time. Send me an email. I can share all that information on how to get wood chips. To confirm, clover can be used as mulch for any indoor plant, or are there certain plants that do better with certain mulches? Clover, clover, like I said, like clover, like be careful with like smaller things that may compete with like strawberries. For the most part, you can use clover for most, bigger plants. Maybe don't use it for like smaller like lettuces and things like that. So yeah, you definitely
No, you don't.
Just a second. I'm gonna try to. Okay.
No. Climbing up where? In the room?
So I'm going ahead. Is there some back? There's some feedback. So I'm going ahead and just muting everybody. But let me know if you want to be unmuted. If you have that question. So and then last part. Yeah. So Clover. Yeah, Clover. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I think as long as you're doing bigger things like just say let me
Just climb the counters like we used to when we were kids. Like, yeah.
Okay, if everybody can make sure they're muted. I don't know why that keeps on coming off, but yeah, okay. So Clover, yeah, I think it does better with bigger things like tomatoes and stuff. It's a really great ground, but for smaller things like maybe lettuces and the strawberries, and I mean not so much. It will spread around really well. Like I get white clover, which is a shorter clover as opposed to like red or crimson. It grows taller and it's not that very as good of a ground cover. But yeah, definitely check it out. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of great information about like using white clover as a living mulch on. And we'll talk a little bit more about in fruit tree class and stuff. It works really well with fruit trees. In the neighborhood when trees cut is best way. Yeah, definitely like when you see a company chipping a tree, that's a great time to run out there and just ask them for wood chips. And there's also we had a couple contractors over order wood chips. So we have a giant pile at the Tacoma Aquatic Center, and one in Fort DuPont. So if you live close by there and you can pick up some wood chips, send me an email. Cool. So moving a little on. So like I said, like a lot of these plants, if you're going to bring them indoors and outdoors, especially if you're bringing them in during the winter and then bringing them out in the outdoors, it's a good idea every time you bring them outdoors, you want to harden them off, which is just basically spending a week, give or take, and bringing them out for an hour the first day in a nice place that's like protected against any harsh winds and partially shaded, and then bringing them out for a couple more hours the next day and a couple more hours. And the idea is like over a week, they'll slowly, get used to the outside, and then you can leave them outside from there. So definitely, make sure to harden them off before you bring them back. All right. So next section, we're going to talk about containers, like what kind of containers actually work best for different kinds of plants. So container sizes, before we talk about materials and types of containers, let's talk about container sizes. So it's a good idea, depending on what type of plant you're getting, to plan to have a decent size container that's large enough to house them. So if you got one like a small container, let's talk about diameter. Like so, good reference point. One of those 5-gallon buckets that you can get at Home Depot. It's about a foot in diameter on the top, and it's a little over a foot deep. So that's a great size for almost any plant. You could do any kind of plant just about in that kind of container, and they'll be super happy. But if you got smaller containers, let's say it's smaller diameters, you want to think about small herbs and strawberries and spinach and lettuces and stuff like that. Those do really well in small areas. But if you're going to do like larger things like kale plants and collards and eggplants and things, you want to have at least a foot diameter. And even bigger with some of these other things. You might get away with like especially indeterminate tomatoes, you can get away with like a foot, but if you can give them a foot and a half, they'll be a lot more happier. But typically, like I said, you can grow anything out of a 5-gallon bucket, even these things. But they'll be happier with a larger bucket. So again, a lot of these are just recommendations. You can make things work, with what you got. But this is ideally what you're going for. But what's more important is your depth size. If you have a very shallow container, like one of these small containers, about all you can really grow are like, again, herbs and strawberries and lettuces and maybe some radishes that don't, go too deep. Everything else is going to need at least a foot. So you need at least a foot of root, depth to for your root growth. So anything less than a foot, it's going to be tough. I mean, this is probably more important than diameter is depth size. Just because most plants, I mean, they typically need about a foot. They're happier with 2 feet, but they could do just fine with a foot. So like I said, reference point, if you don't want to think about it too much, just get lots of 5-gallon buckets or things that are close to that size. But if you got smaller things, kind of stick with your herbs and your strawberries and things like that. And if you have bigger containers, definitely, these things will be happier in bigger containers. All right, then type of containers. So there's a lot of different types of containers out there. We'll go through kind of the typical ones that you see in garden centers. Your first one is just your clay pots. We call them terracotta pots. These are great. They're super cheap. They're natural. You don't have plastics that are going to stay, stay in our environment forever. They'll break down. And what's cool about these pots is they're porous. Meaning even though they look pretty solid, they'll actually they'll leach out different moisture. So it's hard to overwater with these guys because they'll leach out excess water. They'll cool things down in the summer. The soil will stay cooler. They're happier in the summer, as opposed to like something that's completely sealed. The downfall of terracotta is because they're porous. You have to bring them inside, in their basement or something, over winter, because when it freezes, it'll get moisture in their pores, and when it freezes, the water expands and it'll actually break a lot of your pots. So you gotta bring these guys, bring clay pots inside. Then the next side, grade up is they have these clay pots that are glazed over. So this gets rid of the porosity. So you have less drainage and it gets hotter in the summer, but you can keep these guys out during the winter. You don't have to worry about them breaking, like moisture getting in the pores and then expanding and breaking. So, some people like, the more decorative options with glazed ceramic. And then plastic. So this is a very common one. You'll see a lot of plastic ones. Usually when you buy a lot of these pots, they come in these plastic nursery containers. The thing about plastic, like especially these black containers, they absorb a lot of heat. So you'll notice if you keep them in these containers, you'll notice that there'll be space around the edges will start forming, and that's because like the soil actually will start detracting itself from the sides because the sides get so hot. And that's a problem because when you water, instead of water slowly going through the soil on the root ball, it just flushes through the edges and then washes out. One way to counteract that is you can get these like inside slips that you put in there, and that will create a barrier between the hot outside and the cool inside. So that will keep so I'll make it more evenly, and that's going to keep it, the soil, being watered. So if you do want to keep it in the nursery containers, just look for these little slips, these inserts. But then they make some really cool plastic containers that have their own like water capturing saucers and stuff. So these are really nice. You water them on the top, and there's actually its own basin on the bottom. So it's really hard to overwater. Eventually, it will start seeping down this crack if you overwater it. But and then it has that, and because it has that capillary refills, as the soil starts drying up, it'll actually pull that water back. So it's really cool watering system. But the thing about plastics, it's just we have so much plastic in the world that it's nice to avoid plastic when possible. And it just gets really hot in the summer for outdoor plants. You can get really hot plants, but it's super cheap and super affordable and versatile. Then some of your more, heavier and not so versatile, but more maybe renewable stuff, like wood. You can buy, these wood barrels are really nice. They're a little bit more expensive, but wood, is great. I mean, we that's why we make raised beds out of wood, because it's just very, versatile in the summer. It doesn't get too hot. It's cheap enough, so it's, yeah. So these are nice. But then if you want really long-term, plants, that like concrete is really great. Concrete, it stays cool in the summer for the most part, but it's just super heavy, and it's just a pain in the butt to deal with. But it is good for hot situations. It'll keep plants somewhat cool. And then metal is a really another great option. But again, the downfall of meadow is it gets really hot in the summer. But that just means you have to water a little extra. The soil is going to dry out quicker, so you just need to water a little bit more with a meadow plant as opposed to like a terracotta or a wood bin. But meadow is really cheap. You typically want to look at galvanized steel, which is steel that's been like it's been processed in the way that it doesn't rust or anything in the outdoors. And there's been all kinds of studies because people always ask, well, does galvanized leach out anything? And every study I found, it doesn't really leach stuff out. It will leach a little bit of, I think, aluminum or something like that when acids are spilled on it or you have acidic things on it. It will pull out, you know, but not not any more than like what we already have in our soils, our natural amount of soil. So this is at least what I've read is like galvanized is perfectly fine for edible gardens. If you want to be sure, you can Google it, you can research it yourself. But everything I found says it's good for edible gardens. And the last thing is you want to think about colors. You know, the darker the color, that means the more a heat it's going to absorb. So the hotter the container, which just means that you're going to have to water more. So having more of a reflective thing, going more towards white that will actually reflect instead of absorb sunlight is a good option if you want to reduce the amount of watering. So it says, do you think concrete planters are okay for full sun? I think so. I mean, I know like concrete pads like will absorb a lot of heat, but I don't know. I be honest, I don't have a lot of experience with concrete planters. I have made raised beds out of concrete blocks, and I've noticed, at least with concrete blocks, it doesn't absorb the amount of heat that you would get with like a parking lot. You know, a concrete parking lot's going to absorb a lot heat. But what I found is it stays relatively cool, so it doesn't get that hot. So I'm just assuming that's going to be the same with containers. But again, like I don't know a whole lot about. Don't have much experience with concrete containers, so you may want to research a little bit about it. All right, and then there's some smart pots or these really cool pots. I used to work for Casey Trees. I was a tree planter for several years, and these just came about. Nurseries just started using these smart pots, and they're really great to developing like really healthy root balls. Because a lot of times when you just have a normal plastic container and you don't pot up, the roots just start growing in these unhealthy patterns. Yeah, it's bad root growth. You have to tear the roots apart in order to get the water to it. It's very unhealthy. But what this does is they're made out of landscape fabric, and when the roots touch the edges, they'll actually grow through the landscape fabric. But as soon as they get to the other side, once they start poking out, the tips will rot off. The tips of the roots will actually rot or fall, die and fall off, and that's like a self-pruning thing. It's actually healthy. If you look up pruning, even though pruning, like, it sounds awful and you're cutting things off of your plants, whether you're root pruning or branch pruning, it's actually a healthy way to maintain your plants, and it stimulates a lot of healthy growth. So what happens is that every time it self-prunes all the root ends, and instead of like growing around in a circle like this unhealthy growth, it just starts producing these really nice healthy root balls. And then we noticed that, we were comparing the trees that we got that were grown in these versus the trees that were in pots, and the root balls are just so much healthier. The downside is it's really hard to remove. It's like landscape fabric. You have to like rip out the fabric, and you need like some pruners or scissors to get these to take these things out. But they're really great. They're collapsible. They build healthy root systems, and they're great with drainage. The only problem is it's like you have to if you're keeping them out in full sun, you're going to have to water them a lot because they'll dry out a lot quicker as it's something that's got more of a solid structure sides. All right, so question, I sometimes plant in cinder blocks and always line them with landscape fabric first. Yeah, so definitely when you're planting in concrete blocks and cinder blocks, I would recommend um, uh, making sure they're concrete blocks. Cinder blocks, they're a little bit hard. It's hard to tell the difference. Cinder blocks are usually, they look exactly like concrete blocks, but they're lighter. They mix them, because it's for industrial use, they mix fly ash, which is a lot of heavy metals from coal plants and stuff. They mix that in. For some reason, it's just a stable thing that makes the concrete a lot lighter. So that's why when you're doing this stuff, definitely. It's a good thing you're late. You're aligning it with landscape fabric, so you don't have to worry about like the heavy metals or anything. That should be fine. But when you're just playing directly into concrete, you want to make sure they're concrete blocks and not cinder blocks. But yeah, that should be fine. I wouldn't redo anything as long as you have that landscape fabric, even if it is cinder blocks. You should be okay. Just having some kind of barrier between that and the soil. For smart pots, the plant can stay in the pot and pot up as usual into bigger pots. Yeah, you can pot up for sure. like I said, it's really hard, especially if you let them grow for a while. It's really hard to take them out. Like you almost have to kind of like tear apart this pot to transfer them, because once the roots start getting to the edges, they just kind of fuse together like landscape fabric. But a lot of these container gardens, a lot of times, you're not going to really pot up. I mean, the whole point of container gardens is to be more versatile, and so a lot of times you're not going to pot up much beyond the 5-gallon bucket. So you're going to keep, and that's fine. If you could just get up to about 5 gallons with most of these plants, they'll be fine. And then the smaller plants like herbs and strawberries, you can keep those in smaller containers. So you don't always have to think about potting up as much. A lot of times with perennials, I would think more about dividing them. So like with perennial plants, they're going to come back every year. Their root balls are going to get denser and denser, and they're going to get woodier. So like you talk about lavender and rosemary, perennial herbs, or different kind of perennial bushes and stuff. So a lot of times you want to divide them, where you just take them completely out, cut the root ball into multiple sections, and then repot them into their own pots. So I definitely think with container gardens, it's more about dividing rather than potting up. But for sure, definitely. Cool. Yeah, definitely. Like, I mean, don't feel overwhelmed. Like you got to keep them. These are not like seedlings. Seedlings you have to pot up and you have to stay on top of it yourselves. But like container gardens, I mean, how big you want to get. So, and that's going to be how big you're going to get. And like I said, like just stay with don't go bigger than you want. And then if it's a perennial plant, just like every couple years, divide it. So it doesn't overgrow the pot. Cool. And then you can actually, because some of those smart pots are kind of expensive, so you can actually make your own, get some landscape fabric. You can actually sew in a sewing machine or just line up milk crates, and you can make some really awesome smart pot designs. And then like the biggest one that people do with container gardens are repurposed containers, using anything from swimming pools to old recycling bins, to shoe holders, all different kinds of things. So when you're repurposing, you definitely want to think about a couple of things. One is you want to make sure you repurpose with things that are like food grade, or just not going to leach out some toxic things. So things to kind of avoid are like tires. You see a lot of gardens that have fun tires. I mean, it's a fun thing to do, and you can do tire planters. Just don't put edibles in there, because I mean tires are a very industrial product. There's a lot of things that could leach out. So again, you can do flowers and things like that, but don't plant a bunch of lettuce in a tire. Plastics, we'll have a whole slide on different plastics and pallets and stuff, but you want to be careful which one plastics and pallets to use. And anything that's non-food grade, anything that's like before this, made in the 70s and earlier, may have like lead paints and stuff like that. But outside of that, there's a whole lot of different kinds of plastics you can use: containers, gutters. This is my coworker that grew a sunflower out of a shoe. So I mean, you can get very versatile hanging things, paint buckets. So gutters, yeah, gutters work for lettuces. So someone remarked, gutters seem too shallow. Does it really work? Yeah, and I see this with a lot of hydroponic centers. Like a lot of hydroponics setups will have just gutters on racks, and they'll grow a lot of lettuces and things like that. Yeah, so again, like think about that, that chart back there that we have, the things that don't need much depth, like herbs and strawberries and lettuces and spinaches. Those are really great things for gutters. But yeah, definitely not like a tomato plant or anything like that. It's just not that deep enough. Yeah, PVC, is that safe for food? No. So we'll talk about that in a second. Yeah. So with plastics, whenever you look at plastics, it should have these little triangles with a number in it. Each number, there's basically 7 different kinds of categories with plastics. And there's a bunch of them that are safe, like 1, 2, 4, and 5 are really safe for your plants, and then 3, 6, and 7 you don't want. And all plastic breaks down in sunlight. So all poly will slowly decompose when it's in sunlight. The chlorophyll and all that stuff just breaks it down. But some things break down and stably, and then other things break down and kind of leach industrial stuff into it. So that's what you want to be kind of careful with. So 1, 2, 4, and 5. So these are like 1, 2. So 2 is like one of the better ones. It's polyethylene. It's very stable. Like look for garden hoses. They make a lot of garden hoses out of PVC and polyvinyl. PVC it leaches some toxic things. People still use PVC for like low tunnels, like building low tunnel hoops and stuff. We'll talk more about that and like ways to safely use that. But mostly PVC is used to like as pipes to bury. PVC is not meant for sunlight to touch it, because when sunlight breaks down, then you can start leaching some things. And again, these things they're not like poisonous things. They're just like toxic things that will accumulate over time that you just want to avoid. But like a lot of hoses are made out of PVC. So you want to research, don't buy hoses that are made out of PVC. You want to look for polyethylene hoses. So these are much more stable, like your buckets, like your 5-gallon buckets are made from number 2, the polyethylene. This is a really fantastic stuff. And then like 4s are like, frozen food bags, squeezable bottles, things like that. 5s are reusable microwave, yogurt containers, things like that are all stable. And then 6 and 7, 6 is like styrofoam, and 7 is just like a wide variety of things that you just want to, not everything's bad, but you want to avoid most of it. So if you have a container and you're not sure about it, just look for it. You're looking for 1, 2, 4, and 5 are the things that are good in sunlight. And then avoid 3, 6, and 7 for sure. And then if you do have a PVC hose, it's not the worst thing in the world. You just want to keep it out of sunlight. Just keep it in a shed, or keep it under a tarp or something. Because how it leaches out is it'll have a little bit of water in the hose, and then the sun will hit that hose, and then it'll slowly leach out into the water. It needs a little bit of water and needs sunlight to leach. So if you do have a PVC hose, what you could do is just kind of, when you turn your hose on, it's just like flush it out into your yard for like a couple seconds, and then water your garden. And so there's ways around. You don't need to like throw everything away and start anew, but definitely for sure. When you're buying new things, make sure it's polyethylene. I have a whole slide on I think it's on your class or one or two about safe materials. But where hoses, you want polyethylene, and you also want nickel plated couplings. Couplings are the metal ends, because the brass plated will actually leach out some lead over time, but the nickel plated are the safest ones. So and then pallets. So a lot of people use pallets in gardens. I mean, you can't. Yeah, there's some crazy rabbit holes on Pinterest of just like amazing pallet gardens. It's really cool. People will attach them to the wall and fill them for. They may have to put bottoms on each layer, but they'll fill it for soil, or making like freestanding things. A lot of people make compost bins out of pallets and things like that. So when you're doing pallets, you just want to make sure. Because pallets are typically treated. They're industrial use, so they're treated so they don't break down quick enough. And they're treated in a number of different ways. One, they could be heat treated, so that they just warm it up, and that will get rid of any kind of fungicides or insects or anything in there. But then you want to avoid, a lot of times they'll chemically treat these pallets. They'll treat them for again, like diseases and things like that could be shipped from country to country. So most pallets will have some kind of stamp on them. It's one of those things that you never notice until you're looking for it, and then like you'll find it pretty easy. A lot of times they're pretty faded, but if you could just make out an HT, then you're good to go. If it's got an HT, you can use it for your gardens. It's fine. It's great wood. But if it's got an MB, you want to don't use that, because that's might be full of some some toxic fungicides, pesticides kind of stuff. And then there's a bunch of other stuff like deep bark is more like just pine and stuff. But most of these things, I mean, it's either going to be HT or MB, are your two things for your pallets. So definitely check that out. And then you can make some really some water smart, repurpose things. I really like these, like taking like a 2 liter, cutting them, in half, putting them upside down, and then that makes like a little channel of water. And then you make sure the soil goes all the way down to the end. That's like a wick. And then when you water, if you got to go, away for vacation, maybe fill that, completely full. And then as the soil dries out, it'll suck the water back up. Or different ways of just like capturing water as you water the top, it just slowly leaches all the water to the bottom. These are really great when you have like balconies and stuff and you don't want to like leach out water on the person below you. So definitely really cool, a lot of really cool ideas. And then trellises are the last part. Again, like try to find plants that don't need trellises, or if you're doing, like, if possible, if you're doing a vine plant, like hang it, instead of trellising it. Sweet potatoes and tomatoes and stuff, you're really good hanging, just because it's just hard to sometimes trellis. I mean, you can see some of these designs, like it's really great if you could actually install the trellis against the wall. Because imagine if you just have that pot and it's freestanding and you just hook that trellis to that pot. I mean, that thing's going to fall over pretty easy. Or if you have something like stick it into a corner somewhere, or there's a lot of different designs you could try out. But again, I mean, think about top heavy things. How can you not only build the trellis, but how can you like secure these things so they're not going to fall over every time there's a harsh wind? So definitely things to kind of think about. And then I found this the other day on Facebook. I just thought this was the coolest structure. So just building some kind of wood structure and having, individual, 5-gallon buckets in there. So this person grew, all different kinds of pepper plants, from the 5-gallon buckets. So just thinking lots of different, ways to do this. I really like the stadium seating, because that's going to ensure you get like lots of sunlight for every one of these plants. If it was just flat, that's so good. They'll still get a lot of sunlight, especially in the summer when the sun's like really high in the sky. But stadium seating will ensure it gets a little bit more sunlight. So yeah. Again, you don't have to build stadium seating, but it'll give more sunlight. So question. So can Concord grapes work on a trellis only against the wall? Yeah, you could in theory do a Concord grapes. We're going to talk a lot more about grapes and how to like structure grapes in our fruit tree class. But grapes typically need like a T-looking trellis. So you have a single stalk that will come up. So you could definitely do a grape. Probably, I would assume. I've never done one, but I assume you could do a grape in the 5-gallon bucket. And then just have it, have some, kind of trellis that just has a single stalk so it can grow upward. And then it branches out as a T. So it has 2 main stalks, lateral, branches from that main stalk that go at 90-degree angle east and west, outward. And so you just need to build some kind of structure. You could just have a giant, I'm forgetting. I can't remember the name. But then if someone can remember the kind of net, what this is called, but you could have a giant thing that you could branch out, you could tie. Espalier is the type of planting. I just can't remember like the netting, the wood structure, the wood netting. It'll come to me in a second. So you can have a giant one, or you can have, a wire structure, so you can grow a branch up to a certain point, and then when they start going, laterally for the T, you could just have a wire with 2 stakes. So again, we'll talk about like how to trellis grape plants in our fruit tree class. Question. But yeah, I believe you can. I would imagine you could definitely do a grape in the trellis. You just need to, need to have a big trellis area, because grapes, I mean, you can let them grow horizontally on the tease parts, 10 feet or so. So yeah, it just depends. And a lot of times, some people will also get like more conventional or some non-conventional trellises. Like they'll have a pergola, and they'll grow the grape on top of that pergola and let it kind of like the grapefruits hang down and stuff. So again, we'll talk a lot about that for the in the fruit tree class. So another question: do you keep your garden paths in the same location each season? For me, I spread new soil and then repath for the spring season. This is why I asked about the wood chips are bad for the garden, because they could get into the soil when repathing the new season. Does metal not work well for so yeah, let's see, keep your garden. I for the most part, yeah, my garden paths are basically the same. I mean, I guess you could do different garden paths every year. I mean, I typically have, you know, 3 feet walking paths that are the same, and maybe like the 1 foot paths in between rows that I'll plant inside my garden might be different. And then maybe I'll do that kind of differently. So yeah, I mean, if yeah, I still don't think it's that big of a deal to use, you know, if you're, because the wood chips will eventually break down over the year. So it's not, so if you're going to do a different path the following year, most of those wood chips should be gone by the following year. So I think that still works all right. But does metal not work well for trellises because it gets hot? No, I mean, it's not because it doesn't get hot. I think it's more because it's heavier. But yeah, you can definitely, like, you can do metal cages and stuff, for sure, with your plants. It's just, I'm just thinking it's going to be heavier and more top heavy. And we'll talk a lot more about espalier on the fruit tree classes. Espalier is a really cool way to kind of like prune like a fruit tree to grow 2-dimensional along a wall rather than growing it, you know, 3-dimensional, you know, outward. So we'll talk how to do that during the fruit tree class. Cool. All right, so last, you know, so we're gonna have like now we're gonna talk about just kind of like drainage and stuff, things to look for. Um, Definitely, all your pots need to have really good drainage. And some pots don't. You know, sometimes terracotta only have like one hole, which sometimes is fine, but it's a good idea. You know, if you're not getting good drainage out of them, or it's getting clogged too easy, like maybe if you're not using the best soil, you might want to think about drilling a couple more holes and, you know, adding more drainage. If you have a metal container, you're using the nail and the hammer to just kind of poke holes. But you gotta have really good drainage for your pots, or else your roots are. I mean, that's the quickest way to kill a plant, is to not have good drainage, because your roots do need oxygen. They suck up water but then as the water dries out, oxygen comes back in, and then they can suck up oxygen. So it's almost like a lung. They need to, like, you know, the water, when you water, it pushes all the oxygen out, and then the roots, you know, drink up that water, and then as the water dries up, the oxygen comes back in. So it should be like, it's like, yeah, like a lung is what you're going for. Oh, here's a myth. So a lot of people think by putting gravel on the bottom of the container that you're going to have better drainage. I can see, like, maybe if you have some big holes and stuff, if your drainage is too bad, you don't want, you know, your soil leaching out, you can do some gravel. But for the most part, that doesn't really work out very well. If you're using good soil, good potting soil, what that does is just reduce your amount of grow room. And good soil, you know, potting soil should have no problem draining. If you're forced to use like some bad topsoil or clay, maybe you want to use that. But as long as you're getting good, decent, you know, potting soil, and we'll talk about soil in a second, you should be fine. I mean, what this is going to do is just reduce the amount of room for your roots to grow. So I would avoid doing this stuff unless there's this particular reason why, like, you have to. I would avoid like lining the bottoms with gravel. Again, like trying to figure out different ways to capture that water, especially if you're in a balcony, you know, having like, you know, different pots will drain into other pots using saucers, these pre-installed, you know, saucers in some of these containers. Definitely, yeah, you do not want to be dripping water on the balcony below you. Yeah, you'll definitely get cause some trouble then. So someone asked, does this work for concrete planters? I don't know which one question. You may have to elaborate on that. I tried balcony gardening once and totally flooded the closet of the tenant below. Yes, definitely. You need to be, if you're doing balcony gardening, you need to be very responsible and make sure none of your water is overflowing, because that's going to go into the people below you. Oh, the gravel. Yeah. No, I think, yeah, gravel's good for any, you know, yeah, even if you have like any kind of pot, even if you have a concrete pot. Like I said, I mean, the only ways I would say using gravel is if you're forced to use like bad topsoil that just compacts, and you want to add a little bit of drainage on the bottom, or if your holes are too big and you're worried about, you know, your soil, you know, washing away. But for the most part, I would just avoid concrete or avoid gravel for most of your containers. And then container soil. So don't use topsoil. Don't use, you know, soil from your yard or your garden. You want to get really light, fluffy, porous, you know, soil that's not going to compact. Because if you put topsoil in here, it's eventually going to slowly compact, and it's going to be less, you know, drainage. But this kind of soil, potting mix is what you're going for, or indoor mix, or something like that. You don't necessarily need seedling mixes and stuff. I would recommend potting mix, but a lot of times this is called soilless media. So it's because it doesn't actually have topsoil in it. It's more of like some kind of mixture. Like a lot of DIY ones are like a third compost, a third vermiculite, and then like a third, peat moss or coconut coir. So vermiculite or perlite, it adds a lot of structure. That's like a lot of like I always forget, like either shale or volcanic rock that's super heated and then it puffs up. Like all these little styrofoam, it looks like a styrofoam balls are actually perlite. They add, soil structure, add porosity, keep things from compacting. So they're really great to add. Question: peat moss and versus coconut coir. So peat moss. So these things add soil structure and drainage. But peat moss is a non-renewable material. It's farmed from, extracted from different like peat bogs in like Finland and Ireland and Canada, and we're finding a lot of these peat bogs are actually really great sources of carbon sequestration. They're and by tearing them up, we're like we're not doing favors for climate change. So it's important when you can find coconut coir. This is like, shredded up coconut husk. Try to use coconut over peat moss. Sometimes that's not always the option, but definitely try to when possible. Use the giveaway bag with hole in bottoms, mainly with color for pot. Definitely, yeah. I've definitely seen a lot of people grow out giveaway bags and stuff. You just gotta poke some holes in the bottom, for sure. And then like, fertilizing. So it's a good idea, fertilize once a year. Or just add some compost, top dress, or if you're doing annuals, pull out all your garden soil, mix in some compost, and then put it back in. That's going to, just because your plants are going to eventually use up all the nutrients. So you got to replenish it somehow, whether it's adding compost, maybe adding some compost tea, or just some kind of like, fertilizer. This is my go-to. I talk about this every class, just because it's a no-brainer. It's Neptune's Harvest. It's got fish, which is macronutrients, liquid fish, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then it's got seaweed, which is micronutrients. So it's got a little bit of everything, and it's very low dosage, so you don't it's really easy to over fertilize things. Like Miracle-Gro, that's why I don't recommend that stuff. It's too high, and you just get unhealthy growth. So the idea is you just pour a little bit, like a capful, into a watering container, mix that up, and then just water it. And I wouldn't, I don't water my outside garden more than once a season, and I wouldn't water a container garden more than once a year, mainly just because all these fertilizers have salts, and normally it's not a big deal if you do it, responsibly. The salts will wash away before they accumulate, but if you add too much fertilizer, you're going to start accumulating salts, and that's going to eventually be a problem. It's but which we'll talk about in a second. And then just understanding the difference between overwatering and underwatering. So, because a lot of times they look very similar. Like a lot of times underwatering, you'll have a whole plant, it'll get yellow, it'll just get droopy, it'll look, really bad. Overwatering, you see a lot of brown tips. You'll see it getting like moist, maybe the stalks get soggy. You might even get some smells. If you don't have good drainage, your soil will start smelling. Yeah, so just it's but sometimes it's tricky, because they kind of look, very similar, underwatering and overwatering. So the best part is just do the finger trick, stick your finger in that soil 2 to 3 inches. If it's if there's moisture, below an inch, don't water it, and then let it kind of dry out, and then water it the next day. Don't, but if you let it dry out, don't let it dry out for more than a day. Like, don't go on vacation. Like, if you're about to go on vacation and then in this moist soil, go ahead and just water that really well. If you're checking it, once a day or once every other day, give it a chance to kind of dry out, let the oxygen come in, and then water it. And you're going to have a lot healthier plants that way. Cool. And then some maintenance tips for your gardens. One is sanitize your pots. You know, if you're using annuals, like perennials is a little bit hard. Maybe when you like pull them out to divide them, you can sanitize them. Because a lot of times you can see, like we're talking about the salts that accumulate with fertilizers. You'll see the salts accumulating on the sides of the pots. So it's a good idea, if you're reusing pots every year, you know, dump the soil out and just kind of scrub the salts off, and use like a 1 to 9 bleach water mixture to kind of clean your pots, you know, every year. Um, and then like soil too, if you had, you know, again, like if you had some diseases, maybe you want to sanitize your soil, and you can actually, you could bake your soil in your oven, and that's a good way to sanitize it. And then but then you want to mix some compost or some compost tea, just to get that, because you're going to kill all your biology, so you want to bring that biology back with some compost or compost tea. Question, a couple questions. I've always read vermiculite and perlite are not similar. Vermiculite is like a mini Corrigan and will absorb water, whereas perlite is not going to hold on any water. Exactly. So vermiculite and perlite are a little bit different. Both of them will provide some kind of soil structure. Um, it's just one, yeah. Like so this is perlite. It's like it's expanded. It's like the styrofoam balls, you know, but it's actually expanded lava rock, um, or expanded lava glass or something like that. I don't know. But this does not hold on to nutrients. It's basically just it'll just adds porosity to your, you know, so it increases drainage. And then vermiculite is this stuff. I think it's like heated shale or something like that. This will add porosity, but it was also will hold on to some things. So it all depends, you know. So it adds a little bit of retention, water retention, nutrient retention. So they both a lot of times they're used similarly, because they're mixing them. You're mixing it because you want to add porosity, but vermiculite will add a little bit more retention, and then perlite will add a little bit more drainage. But ideally, they're very similar. Like so it's okay. A lot of people use them interchangeably. But yeah, those are the kind of the differences between perlite and vermiculite. Can make a big difference in your mix. They are not. Oh, okay. So you're saying they're not interchangeable. So yeah, maybe read up a little bit. It I've seen them interchangeable a lot. But again, if you want to add more drainage, you know, perlite. If you want to add more retention, vermiculite. But yeah, definitely. Thanks for pointing that out. Can I use Neptune's harvest in my hydroponic garden? I don't know. I would think so, but definitely research that first. Well, thanks. Okay, and then fungus gnats. Okay, so hopefully you won't ever have this problem, but I mean, if you do start having, they look like fruit flies. Basically, they're coming out of your pot. They'll be little larvae. It's mainly because there's some exposed soil, and the fly will the fungus gnat fly will lay its eggs. So there's a couple quick ways to like kind of treat. If you want to treat your soil, get some of these mosquito dunks and just plop one into a bucket of water, and then water your plants. That will kill any larva that's inside their soil. So I'll take care of it. And then if you have flies flying around, these apple cider vinegar tricks work really well. You just pour some apple cider vinegar or some orange juice or something like sugary, and then make a funnel on the top, and then the flies will fly in, and they can't really figure out how to fly out. And make a couple of these, bump them around. That should take care of your fly issues within a day or two. You can get fly paper and stuff like that will also help. But the main cause is if you know you're having an issue with it, get some of this like pebble gravel, because they don't like to lay their eggs on top of pebbles. You know, they only expose soil, so that will help out a lot. And then potting up. So we did talk a lot about pot, you know, like, so like if you have small plants and you want to slowly pot them up, or you buy something small and you want to get them and you have the space, you know, definitely do that. But for the most part, you're not going to be potting up too much with container gardens. This is going to be more about just dividing things and perennial things. But when you do pot up, you know, a lot of times, you know, with container gardens, you know, like the roots will start growing around in circles. So it's a good idea to just kind of cut those like circular roots and kind of just tease things out a little bit, and then pot them back up. Um, but again, like most of what you're going to be doing is mainly like dividing instead of potting up. So instead of like when you're when you're herb, when you're perennial, when you're like lavender gets too big, instead of finding a bigger pot, let's just chop it up in some pieces and put it into several same size pots or smaller pots. So really easy, just pull that thing out, that root ball. It's a good idea to do it like the end of winter, like April, like March, April-ish, but you could really do this anytime, but I think it's best when they're dormant. It's less shock. You pull out the root ball, you can either like tease it apart with your hands. Maybe you have to cut it with a shovel or saw, pruners, just break that up into different sections, and then replant them in the different containers, or give them away as plant presents and things like that. So yeah, great way. That's what I love about perennials. They just constantly are mass producing themselves. And then same with strawberries. So strawberries spread by runners. So strawberries are perennial plants. After after about after 3 or 4 years, they start declining in production. So it's a good idea when we have old strawberry plants that aren't producing, just like cut, just remove those, get those out of the garden. But a lot of times they'll send these horizontal roots that will run, and then they'll have these baby plants that will spread all over the place. And a lot of times they'll overcrowd themselves. So a good idea is like if you're doing a container, just you want to thin them out. We're really easy. I mean, these guys, they have really shallow root systems. You just got to find the runner root. You cut that, and then cut, on the other side, and you just pull these guys out, and then you can put them in another pot. You can plant them around. Or if you don't have room, you just thin them out and throw them away. But the idea is you want to kind of space them out every 4 to 6 inches. So and that will give them some proper spacing to start producing more strawberries. But a lot of times you don't need to really do that the first couple of years. You just kind of let your strawberries establish themselves, and then after a couple of years, you want to start thinning them out just to keep up that production. And getting rid. And if you start noticing certain strawberries are getting older and they're not producing, cut those guys and get those guys out. All right, and pruning. So again, we talked about pruning like branchy stuff, in order to make more bushy plants. But you're going to be pruning a lot of your perennials. You're going to be pruning them every year. It's just because they're going to overgrow. They're going to get too big for your pots. So a lot of times you could do this. You could do structural pruning. It's a good idea towards the end of winter when they're dormant. But a lot of times when they're indoor the house, when they're inside the house, it could be any year because maybe they don't go dormant. It just depends on what you do over the winter, but yeah, a good time is like April, March, April is a good time to do this. So I mean, feel free to just cut, if you got a big bush, cut it back to a smaller bush. Reduce all the lateral branches. Take, thin out the bigger branches. Just get it back to the size that you're more comfortable with, and then you can prune them. And if you need to throughout the year, if it's just getting too big and you can't handle it, feel free anytime. A lot of these perennial herbs, once they're established, they can take a beating, so you can cut them back pretty heavy throughout the year. But it's a good idea to try to just if you're going to do it every year, try to do it around like March, April, and then like pruning like the tips off, like if you have deadheads, like if you have which are just flowers that have already bloomed and now they're just sitting there, or you'll see a lot like with raspberries and stuff, after you pick the fruit, the blooms will still be there kind of rotting. So you want a good idea to cut all those, we call it deadheading them, like cut out like your spent blossoms, because that's just going to be wasted energy. So try to do that whenever you see them, like whenever the flower's done blooming, get in there and cut that out, so it's just not wasting energy. And a lot of times when you're moving container plants, back and forth, like outside, inside, different rooms and stuff, you'll notice that there may be a bit of a shock, in different environments. So a lot of times you'll have leaves drop and things like that. That's like a normal process. They're just readjusting. If it starts losing more than like a third of its leaves, maybe you want to, start thinking like, do I need to fertilize? I need more sunlight, something like that. But for the most part, I mean, every time you change the habitat, it's going to readjust and it's going to drop the leaves. So just know that's okay at a certain point, but once you start losing a lot of leaves, like more a third or a half, then you might think that maybe I moved it into the bad location and I need to find out what's happening. And then again, we talked about all these concepts, crop rotation. So if you're doing annual plants, it's a good idea to mix up your pots. Don't plant the same, tomatoes in the same pot every year, because that's with the same soil, because that's going to, just deplenish your soil. Try to mix up your pots. If you have 5 or 6, containers, try to plant, and you're planting annual tomatoes and peppers and stuff. Try to plant, different plants in different plots every year, just to kind of change up like you know, uh, how much fertility you're taking out of the soil, how much fertilizers. And if possible, if you're doing beans, legumes like a peas in the spring and beans in the summer, maybe try to designate one pot that just has peas and beans and legumes, and maybe a clover over the winter, and that's going to add nitrogen, because they're nitrogen fixers. Legumes, they actually suck nitrogen out of the air and deposit it, these nodules in their roots that slowly leach out into the soil. So maybe designate one container just to be a nitrogen fixer, just with peas, beans, and clovers, and then move that, and switch that every year, make that designate a different container, and that's going to kind of refertilize your soil. So, but again, main thing about crop rotation is just try not to plant the same annuals in the same spots every year. But we've talked a lot about crop rotation already, so I just want to put this stuff in as reminders. And even cover crops, if you're not going to use containers over the winter, or if you have some containers that aren't being used in the summer that you just don't have plants in, maybe get some buckwheat, maybe throw some buckwheat on the top of the containers. That will grow really quickly. They'll keep weeds from coming in. This is more for like outdoor containers. And then when you're ready to plant, you can just, chop that stuff up, mix it into the soil, and, give it like a week, it'll break down and add a lot of nutrients. And then you can plant a tomato into that container. Or if you're not planting over the winter, you want to kind of replenish some of your soils and containers, plant like clovers and, winter rye and winter wheats and stuff. Daikon radishes are a great way to inject, organic matter into soil. So you grow these giant radishes, and then you just don't harvest them. You let them just kind of rot and they'll break up and add organic matter into your soil. So these are things that you can do over the winter. Again, but a lot of times with container gardens, it's not a big a deal to just kind of in the spring, dump all your soil, mix in compost, throw it back in. So it's not as needed as like a yard garden. Like cover crops are probably more beneficial, and for gardens that are planted in the ground or raised beds. But definitely, if you're not growing over the winter, might as well just try some of this stuff out, and it's a great way to add a lot of nutrients to your soil. And then the last part, we're going to talk a little bit about some self-watering containers. So these are ideas. The idea behind this is that you have to go away for a while and you don't have someone that can water your plants. You could create these self-watering containers that may buy you maybe a week or so before they dry out. And there's a lot of conventional stuff like these um, terracotta pots. Back in long ago, back in the day, they used to bury these pots in the ground because they slowly leach out water, and they would just fill that pot full of water, and then that would slowly leach out and then water all the plants around them. So that's one way to water in ground stuff, burying in different containers with small holes. But another way, so this is this is just one design, but the premise of this is very similar to most self-watering containers. Is that you're basically creating with this design, you use 2 5-gallon buckets. And you're basically the top bucket is for soil, is for where you're going to plant your plants, and the bottom is more for water reserves. But it has a special kind of wick where the soil goes down into the water, and what that does is as the soil dries up, it actually capillary refills, they'll actually pull the water up and will water itself until that reservoir is gone. So how they build these with these containers is they get 2 of these 5-gallon containers. On the bottom of one, they'll drill a bunch of holes, and then they'll cut out the center, and they'll get a yogurt cup or some kind of plastic small cup that is half the size of diameter. They'll cut out a hole, they'll attach that with zip ties, maybe they'll punch a bunch of holes around the edges, and then zip tie it together is how I did it. And then that, so when they put that container back in, this is going to be attached to the top container, and it's going to keep that top container up, up a little bit, so you have a little reservoir of water. And then what happens is when you fill the top thing up with soil, you want to make sure the soil gets into that yogurt cup, and that's going to be your wick. So as the soil dries out up here, that soil is going to that wick part that's in the water reserve is actually going to suck up the water and start self-watering from the bottom, the top out. And you can get like reservoirs and stuff, fillers, like you can get PVC pipes as long as it's buried, that you could fill up the reservoir directly. So if you're going to go away for a week, maybe you want to fill this completely full, and then that should self-water itself for a week, and eventually it will run out. But and you want to have also an overflow hole. So if you keep this out in the rain, it's just not going to completely drown your plants. You need the overflow hole in the reservoir. So there's a question: should the water reservoir of self-watering containers be left empty every once in a while so the plant can breathe? Yeah, I would think so, because I mean, eventually, like this bottom part, it's gonna get so anaerobic that you're gonna probably get some like smelly anaerobic. Anaerobic is when there's no oxygen, and it's just completely non-oxygen, and that attracts a lot of like anaerobic bacteria. Some of them are beneficial, like if you're making cheese and beer and things like that, and fermentations. But most of them, they'll create methane smells and stuff. So I mean, you probably wouldn't. I mean, it's not going to be that much. You probably wouldn't do it, but it's a good idea. Like I would only fill this completely up if I was like going on vacation, or I would let it dry. I would for sure let it dry out, just so you don't get any smelly soils down here. For sure, kind of let that breathe a little bit. Definitely. And that's kind of looks, that's the basic premise of self-watering containers, is you have that wick, that soil that goes down. I mean, you don't want it all, because that's going to be, there's not going to be anything growing in this part, because it's going to be so saturated that roots are going to avoid it. But then that's going to, pull the water up and saturate in water from the bottom, the rest of this container. So that's how it kind of looks like from these other steps. All right, and that's kind of what the finished product of what it could look like. And then again, like I would water it normally, but then if I was going to go away and I wanted to fill up the reservoir, I have this tubing where I could fill up that reservoir, and then I know it's going to be watered for a while. All right, so that's the end of the presentation. I will definitely stick around if anyone has any questions. Oh, did I? Oh man, I forgot to. Oh, I forgot to click the recording to start recording again. Okay, well, I'm probably gonna have to do this presentation again by myself, and then I'll post a recording of that. But for sure, that'll just take a little while. But yeah, I'll stick around for a little bit. If anyone has any questions about like container gardens, feel free to unmute yourself too. But let's see, first couple questions. Let's see. Super helpful. I have never had a garden before, only access to windowsills and porches. Yeah, so definitely windowsills. Yeah, for sure. You can do a lot with windowsills and porches. I will be growing strawberries indoors. Do they need to be hand pollinated? I don't think you can really hand pollinate strawberries, but I think they're one of those things that you need to bring them outside. When they start blossoming, I believe they need bees to cross pollinate them. I would look that up just to double check that, but I believe that you'll need to bring them out when they're blossoming, and just let them let the bees do their work, and then you can bring them back inside. The fruit tree class, probably like maybe like a week or two will be the was when the fruit tree class is going to happen. Oh, IT says recording in the upper left-hand corner. Oh, I think I just turned it on. Oh, I'll have to check. Hopefully it turned itself on, but I think I forgot to turn it on. Or maybe not. We'll keep my fingers crossed. If not, I'll just be doing this presentation by myself in my basement. But yeah, the presentation is recorded. Okay, hopefully. If for some reason, because I think you can record your own present. I think you could also record people's Zooms on your side too. So Yeah, so let me check out. Let me see if I could just stop that real quick. Well, so let's see. Stop recording.